Hello and welcome to today's episode of Kendra is Super Timely with the media that she chooses to talk about. Today we are talking about The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. The best time to talk about this book would have been probably when the movie was coming out because, that was a really hot time for this, and now it's a whole new year and no one cares about this anymore. That's probably not true. There's probably still lots of people talking about this, but this is when I'm talking about it, so this is the time that matters for me. It took me a while to get to this book. Honestly, I've been slow to get to literally all of my books. So I ended up reading this in November, which was a mistake because I was super busy with classes. But also, it was nice because I literally finished it, I think, the day that Eli and I went to go see it in theaters. So it was super fresh in my brain when I saw it. One thing that really interested me was that compared to the Hunger Games trilogy, this is a thick boy. Like, it's definitely not the thickest book I've read, but 517 pages. Compare that to the other 3 Hunger Games books. This is thick. This is a lot. And I was definitely worried, sort of knowing Suzanne Collins' writing style from the Hunger Games, that this would be a bit much. But I was pleasantly surprised. There was a lot of character development. I was really amazed at how with the whole situation I was, and sort of the roller coaster that it took me on. So if you don't know, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes is part of the Hunger Games universe. This is a prequel to the Hunger Games trilogy following a young Coriolanus Snow. So without giving too much away, this book and the movie were roller coaster rides. I think the book was more effective than the movie just because we were able to be in Snow's head a little bit more. It's hard to really give full perspective in a purely visual medium. Like, obviously there's dialogue, but you can only give too much exposition before it becomes way too much. Whereas you can usually get away with a lot more in a book, especially a thick boy like this. But I will say, when I went into this book, I already had some preconceived notions about Snow because we saw him be a terrible person in the Hunger Games trilogy. And so as much as I tried to approach this book with an open mind, I was like, I am not going to like him as a character. And I think that was one of my major hesitations when coming into this book. Like, I'm not going to like him. I don't know how long I can stick with a book with a main character that I don't like. So I was amazed at how effectively Suzanne Collins was able to create a sympathetic character out of him. I was shocked by how quickly I sympathized with him as a character. The things that he went through, the things that he endured as a young boy. He is only, I think, 18 in this novel. We are fresh out of the war that created the Hunger Games. He himself is just a child coming out of this situation. We learn about his family and the fact that, he is dirt poor and just barely scraping by, but trying really hard to cling on to a reputation that his parents had established, his grandparents had established. The Snow family was known for greatness, and suddenly that was all ripped away in the war. And so for the past several years since the war ended, he's just been trying really hard to keep up the visuals, even though there's no money. And as the book progresses, it becomes easier and easier to root for him as a character, which I did not expect at all coming into this book. I expected to just hate him from beginning to end, and that's not what happened. So props to Suzanne Collins for making this very hateable character feel very worthy of my empathy, very sympathetic, and sort of relatable. It's not hard to imagine myself in his shoes making the same decisions. And his justifications don't seem completely evil in the beginning. As the book progresses and really as we get into kind of the last part, everything turns. And at the end, you're right back to hating him. And the way that she manages to make this work is amazing. I did not expect to be in the palm of Suzanne Collins' hands, but I was just right there in her little hands. And what I love about this as a prequel book is even though this is I think 60 years before Katniss is involved, we're seeing a lot of developments that hold true to when she does become involved. This Hunger Games very early on, it's the 10th annual Hunger Games, and it's the first time that they're really trying to publicize it and get public interest in it. Because if the public isn't interested in it, what's the point of it? It's not really reminding anyone of anything to do with the war if no one's paying attention to it. And the way that all of the tributes are treated is very different from what we saw from Katniss. Because we saw in the original trilogy that the tributes are all sort of welcomed into capital life for the few days that they are there. They are brought in on this very bougie train, escorted by people from the capital. They are well fed, they are well cared for, they have an opportunity to train before going into the arena. And that's not at all what we see for the tributes in this book. The tributes in this book are treated like literal animals. They are brought in on trains meant for livestock. They are all just sort of lumped together, which feels unsafe because what if they decide to break down and attack each other before they're even in the games? And then they're just dumped into the zoo, left out, exposed to the elements. And it seems that these early Hunger Games were truly gladiatorial style, like just straight up killing each other and that's it. They're put into an arena that is literally just a gladiatorial arena in the heart of the capital where everybody knows where it is. It was surprising the number of tributes that died before the games even started. The movie didn't do a great job at portraying how much time went on before the games actually happened. Like, the movie made it seem like things were still pretty streamlined and everything stayed on schedule. But in the book, the games got held up by several days, if not a couple of weeks. And that's sort of where Snow got involved and started saying, like, we need to feed the tributes, otherwise you're not going to have a Hunger Games, because they are going to starve to death. There are some very unexpected moments that happened. Snow was surprisingly soft as a character. There ends up being a romance that I don't think is entirely unexpected out of a young adult book, but the ways that it presented itself were definitely unexpected and interesting. And I love that we were able to see sort of the slow breaking down of Snow, where at no point did anything that he was doing or anything that he was thinking about, nothing felt out of character. It felt, all of the justifications felt the same, but the circumstances around him had changed. And I could definitely feel as the narrative went on that he was getting a lot more angry and a lot more desperate. I would categorize this very differently from how I categorized you, where Joe would justify all of his things, but it was sort of a misguided justification. Snow definitely lost it at a few points in the story. I think there was a lot of misunderstanding himself and being put under this stress that he really put on himself more than anything, of trying to fit in and meet certain expectations and meet certain goals and be a certain person just because that's who he's supposed to be because of the name that he has. And a lot of what happens is because of those stresses that I think if he were a character by any other name would not be who he is. But as far as the writing style is concerned, I do think that Suzanne Collins is really flexing some strong muscles here. I remember in the heyday, the original heyday of the Hunger Games, a lot of people complained that Katniss's voice was flat. And I've talked about this before, but her voice had to be flat. She was a very traumatized character, and trauma leads to a lot of shutting down and shutting out. Her voice was perfectly captured to convey that. Everything has to be played a little bit straight, even the jokes, just to... It's one of those situations of if you feel too strongly in any way, everything can break down. And that is captured beautifully in the Hunger Games trilogy. Snow has some of that. He is a little bit dry and to the point, and I feel like every character in this world needs that. But his is not to the same extent as Katniss, and I do feel like we feel him a lot more because he's not quite as blockaded. He doesn't keep quite as strict walls. And he's also an interesting character because unlike Katniss, who what you see is sort of what you get at the surface level, he has sort of a social persona that he puts on in the world, and then he also has a family persona that he puts on at home, and then he has himself. So there's sort of at least 3 levels to him, if not 4, because of who he is with his love interest. In a way, he does feel a little bit more developed because there are so many facets to him, so many personas that he has created of himself that we're sort of tracking along. I will say that once you get into part 3, you can see the ending coming from a mile away. And it's really more a matter of how do we get there? How do things unfold for us to get to this ending, which we know has to be the ending? And I say that we know it has to be the ending because we know what he becomes in the trilogy. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up my non-spoilery discussion and say that I absolutely recommend this book, whether or not you were interested in the original Hunger Games trilogy. But I will also implore you to reconsider the original Hunger Games trilogy. I think it got a lot of unwarranted guff in its heyday because it was young adult and everybody was sort of on a anti-young adult binge. I feel like it got a lot of flack that it did not deserve. Recommend the original Hunger Games trilogy. If you have not read this, we are going to be diving into spoilers. I will also be talking about the movie slightly, just as a comparative. I won't be diving too deeply into the movie. More or less just to say maybe areas that the movie did really well, or places that the movie maybe missed that I wish they would have captured better. If you've seen the movie, I do think that it's fine for you to stick around if you want to talk about the book, but the book definitely has some differences from the movie. But if you have not seen the movie or read the book, now would be your time to click away unless you want to get into spoilers. So this is your last chance. Okay, are you gone? Okay, good. So we've already talked about a lot of like the big things that I wanted to talk about, but I really want to talk about Lucy Gray. I think it was an amazing choice to make her come out of District 12 because that puts District 12 very strong on Snow's emotional radar, which I think we get a hint at. And I so love that romantic interest being here because it does give him the fuel and give him sort of the inspiration to draw on when he sees Katniss with Peeta, and to say that this love story needs to continue in the public eye and that the public needs to buy it because he understands how a love story can impact the crowd, can impact the masses because everybody is rooting for an underdog love story. I feel like a lot of the relationship between Snow and Lucy Gray came about because Lucy Gray was the first person that Snow was able to be even remotely honest with. And that largely came out of necessity because he wasn't able to provide for her in the way that he would have been if he were actually capital rich. And so he only gave her what he was able to, and a lot of that came from stealing or borrowing from others. Food that he just sort of happened to have by circumstance. And I think that created a sense of vulnerability, which is where I think he was able to start to develop feelings for Lucy Gray. And then obviously from Lucy Gray's perspective, she fully anticipated the antagonism that comes from being a person from the districts in the capital, and to have this man be nice to her and treat her like she's human rather than a zoo animal like everybody else in the capital treats her. It definitely feels like a circumstance of a person was nice to me and so I like them by default, combined with being in a very traumatic situation of knowing that you're probably going to die, and if you don't die, everyone around you will. You know, it's definitely a rough situation, definitely a rough time, but it was amazing to see how Snow was sort of taking in the whole situation surrounding Lucy Gray and how the conditions that she was put in impacted the future games and impacted what the future games would look like and what things looked like by the time Katniss was in. Because obviously Coriolanus saw that Lucy Gray was being mistreated by being put in these animal carts. And so by the time Katniss is in, those carts have been swapped out for bougie trains. And rather than being left to fend for themselves for the several days between when they arrive in the capital and when they enter the arena, they are fed, well fed. They are given opportunities to bathe and change clothes, and they are kept separate aside from when they are supervised. So there's no opportunity for them to kill each other or maim each other outside of the arena. And it also, in a way, makes it more fair for all of the tributes because they all have equal time to interact with the crowds. They only have the interview. The news people aren't really invited into the space that the tributes are living in for the few days before they go into the games. Whereas when Lucy Gray was in, she was able to get a lot more attention by interacting with the crowds and sort of gaining that public favor in that way. But it was also really interesting how in the moment Snow was interacting with the games and being able to interfere and say, hey, I think that we should introduce betting so that we're making money off of these games. And it gets a lot more public interest. And to give the opportunity for viewers to participate in the games by donating supplies. And it's also interesting, just based on the books, how in here it seems that the supplies are donated throughout the games, and it just seems kind of like a flat cost, whereas by the time Katniss is in, it's at least established in the book that as the games progress, the supplies get more and more expensive. I found it hilarious how the supplies were so clunky and clumsy, and like they had seemingly an unlimited number of drones, but these drones were not good at doing the thing that they needed to do. I do kind of wish that by the 75th Hunger Games, when Katniss was in, that they had better established drones that wouldn't alert anyone to the fact that something had been dropped. I think this was more of a movie situation than a book situation, but I feel like in a Hunger Games situation, the number of parachutes that came down that Katniss received would have been an alert to anyone else that there's a person nearby and we should go after them. But it was interesting to know that like Lucy Gray was not visible on the cameras through most of the time that she was in the arena. And so Snow wasn't able to send anything in to help her because he didn't know where she was. So there was no way to send a drone in because the drones wouldn't know where she was because nobody knew where she was. And that's one of the changes that the movie made that I understand why, but I'm also a little upset by. Because there was a lot of drama and a lot of build-up knowing that we had no idea where Lucy Gray was and if she was even still alive. But in the movie, we knew where she was. We had constant eyes on her. We knew that she wasn't accessible because of where she was hiding, but we knew how she was doing at all times. And I feel like that broke a lot of the tension that was established in the book. Because truly, not a lot was happening in the games in the book because things were operating really slowly and over the course of several days. And I would expect the movie to condense time a bit just because you don't want to show everybody being bored for an extended period of time. Like, you want to show them bored long enough to show that they are bored, but not long enough that the actual audience of the movie gets bored. But there was a degree of tension that was established by the book by making it known that we have no idea what is happening with Lucy Gray, if she lives, if she dies. Showing her in the movie, letting us know that she was alive through all of it, it just sort of dispelled all of the tension there, and I'm really upset about that. I also feel like the movie played the snakes weird. At this point, I don't remember if Snow ever stuck his hand into the snake vat. In the book, it was a big deal that he did because he was very tense about reaching in and touching the snakes, and then the chick followed. And that is what uncovered her lies, was the fact that the snakes didn't touch Snow, but they did touch her. I don't think he ever touched the snakes in the movie. It sort of shattered some of the illusion and shattered some of the setup for Snow putting that handkerchief into the snake vat later. I was also really upset that the movie took out a lot of the narrative with that character. I don't remember her name at this point. I want to say it was like Catherine or Christine or something, but that sounds like way too standard of a name for the capital. Clemencia, I think. I don't know how to pronounce some of these capital names. In the book, she played a slightly bigger role. We see her in the hospital looking absolutely terrifying. She's like got holographic skin going on and scales, and it's just terrifying. And we didn't get any of that in the movie, and I am really disappointed because I wanted to see what she would look like. But also, that visual is far more terrifying than just the idea of if they get bit a lot, they die. Like knowing that if they do survive after being bitten, that there are side effects, and those are life-altering side effects. They're terrifying. They cause mutations. Like, I wanted that, and we didn't get that, and I'm sad. I am intrigued by the fact that Lucy Gray did not suffer any consequences for being involved in cheating in the game. I wouldn't have expected her to die necessarily, but the fact that there seemed to be no consequences whatsoever was a little surprising and a little strange. I don't know if it was because they wanted Snow to interact with her, to know that she was alive. I wish that we had a little bit more information about what that situation was about, but I think it's okay that we don't. Snow getting caught for cheating, though, was definitely a jaw-dropping moment for me. And I was particularly surprised that this was such a big deal because of how involved he was leading into the games. Because he was feeding her, and he was openly feeding her and openly meeting with her, which, having seen the situation of the games with Katniss, like, this feels like a no-no. This feels like it should not be happening, that he is giving his tribute an unfair advantage by feeding her. But this also ends up being the role of the mentor by the time Katniss is involved. It's just a weird situation. It feels very broken and feels very not thought out, which also sort of makes sense because this is the first time that they're doing it, and the first time you get a major organization doing any big major change, everything is an absolute cluster truck. So it was interesting that they did have rules for in the arena of, like, you can't give a tribute a thing to take into the arena. And the fact that they weren't necessarily searched before they went in, because I'm pretty sure Lucy Gray killed some characters with the rat poison. I loved the sort of metaphor of the objects that Snow kept from his parents and how he was so attached to the rose powder from his mom. And I don't remember, I think he ended up losing the compact. It was just sort of kept in the Capitol after it was found with Lucy. But he still had the powder, and that powder ended up getting ruined when he was in the pond or lake or whatever body of water it was. And he ended up just sort of throwing it away at that point. That's the moment when you can tell that he has lost all of his softness. Any piece of his mother that may have been left in him and within him was gone with that powder. And so he just fully became his father, which we learn progressively more and more was a terrible man. So him being sent to be a peacekeeper was not something that I really expected at all, especially as a character who was so convinced that he was going to become president, which I really want to know more about. One, why he thought that this was going to be a thing. Like, do the families like take turns having somebody in power and Snow was just next in line? I don't understand how presidents work in this world, and I do kind of wish that we had a little bit more explanation of how some of those politics work. I also understand that that's not what this book is necessarily about. But to see him leave the Capitol and to become a peacekeeper was a shock. And it definitely felt like a moment where everything broke down for him. It's a situation of, I feel like he was rooting for Lucy Gray, but I think he would have been okay if she had died. But being ripped out of the Capitol and being ripped of a future in the Capitol, it definitely seemed like it was the place to hit him more than anywhere else. I'll say that was the peak of my sympathy for him as a character, was when everything was just sort of yanked away from him. But then he went and backstabbed his friend with the Mockingjay. I was really intrigued by the fact that he was so anti-Mockingjay, sort of treating it like it was this failure from the Capitol, even though the people in the Capitol were still in awe at these creatures and were really excited by these creatures. And he was just like, these are terrible creatures and they need to die. They represent the failures of the Capitol and all of that is wrong with the world. It was really interesting, like, disconnect with him. I kind of wish that there had been a little bit more trauma, like more of a traumatic event that would have happened with these Mockingjays with him. But then to use one of the Jabberjays that were caught to record the conversation with his friend who was admitting to wanting to run away and then letting his friend be killed because of it was dark for sure. And darker still for knowing that his friend's family took him in and basically made him rich again. Being in the district seemed to have the opposite effect of what I would have expected from him, because I truly expected that he would have come away from it with more sympathy, but instead it seemed like he came away from it with more loyalty to the Capitol and more rage at the districts for bringing this destruction unto themselves. The sort of final scene with Lucy Gray, where he sneaks away and they decide that they're going to go off and live in no man's land together, because Snow is convinced that if he stays, he will be killed because they will find the gun that was used to kill other characters. But to find that the guns were stashed in the cabin and that he was able to just get rid of the guns in the lake, and the celebration that he had about being able to go back, and Lucy Gray being like, why? We had this plan. And the absolute paranoia that he falls under after this moment when he can't find Lucy Gray. That particular scene was one that I wish that we had some of Lucy Gray's perspective. I would honestly love a like companion book to this, sort of like Midnight Sun to Twilight, where we get Lucy Gray's perspective of all of these events. I do not anticipate that ever happening, and I do feel like it would be a bit much, but at the very least, I would love to know what was happening with Lucy Gray in this scene, because at this point, Coriolanus Snow has become an unreliable narrator. I do not trust what he says or what he is seeing. He is paranoid. He is a very broken man who is going through a lot, and his senses are failing him. And there's a degree to which I think he sees what he wants to see, whether or not he thinks he wants to see these things. He wants Lucy Gray to abandon him so that he has reason to go back. And he wants Lucy Gray to abandon him so that it can fit within his narrative that the people of the districts are heathens and beastly and awful people, whether or not he is willing to admit that to himself, which we all know he's not willing to admit that to himself. So I would love to know if Lucy Gray was intentionally running away from him, if she was scared of him, especially since he had a gun and he was yelling, if she planned to leave without him, if she died somewhere. I really want to know what happened to Lucy Gray. And the fact that she just sort of disappears into nowhere is frustrating. It's not a bad frustration. I think it's good that we have some of these questions coming out of this book. Like, what happened to her? He doesn't know. There's no way for him to know. And I know that there are like fan theories out there that Katniss is related to Lucy Gray, that Lucy Gray may have been Katniss's grandmother or something, which feels like a stretch because she left the district and there were probably people that would have attacked her if she went back. It's definitely hard telling. Something else that I wish that we would have gotten out of this book is an understanding of what the rest of the world looks like. We do know that Panem is America. Based on the movies, Panem takes up pretty much the entirety of North America. Are the people in England just sort of watching Panem and being like, are the Americans okay? I want a little bit of history about how Panem came to be, and especially if we are saying that Canada and Mexico and the United States are all part of Panem now. How did this like super country come to be? Are there still people around the rest of the world? I remember in one of the original Hunger Games books, I don't remember which one, but I want to say it was one of the times that Katniss and Peeta were on a train and Peeta was talking about wondering what was out there, and there was concern about the fact that if the people of Panem died, there might not be any people left in the world. I want to know if that's true, if Panem is it for the world, if everyone else everywhere else is dead, or if everyone just sort of piled on into Panem. I wish we had some answers to that, but this book clearly was not the time or place to explore that. It would be nice if Suzanne Collins would like release a guide to the Hunger Games just to give a timeline of events and like how things came to be and what the structure is. Just because I have so many questions about like the background world of the Hunger Games. All of that aside, while Snow was in District 12, I knew that there was going to be a time that he was going to get pulled out and put back in the capital. And I knew that it was going to be sooner rather than later. I knew that there was no way that he was going to do his full like 20-year sentence as a peacekeeper. The question was very much a matter of when, not if. It really wasn't a surprise when we found that he was at the Capitol rather than going to training to be an officer. And I definitely was not surprised that it was Dr. Gall who, got herself involved and busted him out. What I was surprised by was that the fact that Snow murdered Higginbottom. When I learned that Dean Higginbottom had come up with the concept for the Hunger Games, a lot of his character definitely came into perspective. It is clear throughout the entire book, and perhaps even more clear in the movie, that he does not like the concept of the Hunger Games. He finds it barbaric, and his drug use combined with his involvement in the Hunger Games makes a lot of sense when we find out that it was his brainchild. And it also made sense why Dean Higginbottom was so anti-Snow, because Snow was the reason why Higginbottom's idea became the thing that it was. And Snow killing Higginbottom felt like a combination of mercy and vengeance. It was definitely not something that I anticipated happening, but it felt very in character, which is surprising for how peaceful Snow seems towards the beginning of the story. But the life view that he has developed throughout this story definitely supports his murder of Higginbottom. And it's amazing how the situation has left him sort of paranoid. He is so certain that Lucy Gray was going to try to kill him and that the Mockingjays were against him. And he didn't love the way it had made him feel stupid and vulnerable. If he ever married, he'd choose someone incapable of swaying his heart. Someone he hated even, so they could never manipulate him the way Lucy Gray had. Never make him feel jealous or weak. People would call him a tyrant, iron-fisted and cruel, but at least he would ensure survival for survival's sake, giving them a chance to evolve. It is amazing how much, so in my copy this is page 516, but how much of Snow's sort of evolved worldview has developed and how much of it is just sort of packed into that paragraph. He has developed such a twisted view of the world because of the people that he's been surrounded with and sort of this weird coincidental evidence that he has collected through this whole experience. One other thing that I am super impressed with this book is how the term snow lands on top, which is sort of their motto, drastically the vibe and the meaning from snow lands on top shifts through this book. Because at first it seems like it's a statement made out of desperation, like they need this little bit of hope that snow will land on top, and then at the end it feels so malicious and so violent and so evil. This is a villain origin story done beautifully, and I love how much was packed in here in terms of both the development of Snow from how he became just sort of this teenager struggling to get by to an evil supervillain essentially, while also establishing how the Hunger Games evolved into what we saw in the 75th annual Hunger Games. And while we don't see the first 9 Hunger Games, this gives us a glimpse into what it probably looked like, because this is the first time that they're really trying to publicize it. And so how dull and almost pointless the first 9 ones would have been because no one knew about it. And how it's evolved to truly symbolize and remember this war that we don't really know why this war happened and what caused this war and why Panem is structured in the way that it is. As a villain origin story, I also love that Suzanne Collins wrote him in such a way that we never have to agree with him. I still had a lot of sympathy for the districts. I am Team District all the way. I like that. I don't know how much it has to do with the way that Suzanne Collins wrote this and how much this just has to do with me, but to compare this to You, within You, I felt like I was sinking into the disturbed narrative of Joe. Whereas in this book, because I saw his sympathetic side early in the story and saw his twist, I was able to sort of keep myself separate and maintaining a different point of view from him while still observing his shift. I don't know if it's just because now I'm paying more attention to what the characters are doing and how they're changing, or if it is actually something in the way that was written. I personally really liked it. I was really interested in seeing how he was changing and how he went from being this really sympathetic character that was in love and young and dumb and turning into this just vile, iron-fisted tyrant. I'm sure that as I edit this video, I will come up with other things I want to talk about and wish that I would have talked about, because there is a lot happening in this book. We didn't even talk about the bombings, but I think that covers really the big points that I wanted to talk about. So let me know down in the comments below what your thoughts are on The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Did you enjoy it? What did you like? What did you dislike? What did you think about the movie? Have you seen the movie? Let me know down in the comments below. And while you're down there, also like this video and subscribe to my channel because I post new videos every Wednesday. And it's a different kind of video every week because it's Whatever Wednesday. Also, next week will be my first week doing Friday videos, which is its own special series, which is actually a structured series, so all of the videos will be related. So be sure to check back in for those. Otherwise, I will see you next Wednesday, and I hope you have a lovely day. Okay, bye-bye.